In this final lesson on the subject of severance, I'm going to cover and focus on the last two methods of severance, spending most of our time on the penultimate method of severance, which is, of course, mutual conduct. We will then touch on the issue of homicide being a method of severance as well. The reason why it's not going to take its own lesson is because it's relatively trivial, it's relatively easy to understand, and it makes sense. But for the most part, we're going to be focusing on the idea of mutual conduct as being the final method of severance. Like I said, briefly touch on homicide at the end of this lesson. Quite straightforward and quite rare, in fact, in circumstances where the question of severance is being asked. Fundamentally, it is a straightforward and very easy to understand and very uncontroversial part of the law. Simply put, you kill somebody for the intention of benefiting from the co-ownership, you have then had the result of which would lead to you severing from the property. So mutual conduct is very similar to mutual agreement in the sense that it has to be done mutually, simply put. It has to be, it's an agreement that is made between the joint tenants, but it's where there is not an express or an implied indication to sever the property, like with mutual agreement. As the beneficial joint tenants, there can still be the achievement of severance, though, through the mutual conduct of the parties. So it can be implied that through the conduct of the parties, severance still takes place. This is where we infer from the conduct of all the parties that their joint tenancy interests ought to be treated as tenancies in common. And so, as a result of which, the easiest way to infer this mutual conduct that severance is desired is if it is clear that the intention of the parties indicates that the right of survivorship should no longer apply to them. This is the easiest way to, through mutual conduct, determine that severance has been at least achievable and desired, and at least wanting to be ascertained. Now, what is the right of survivorship? This is actually something that we haven't touched on yet in co-ownership. It's very, very important, but it is also obviously very important to the issue of severance and mutual conduct. It is something which essentially exists in circumstances of the joint tenancy. If one of the co-owners in a joint tenancy were to die, then that co-owner's interests will automatically pass to the surviving co-owners in law. This is known as the right to survivorship, or right of survivorship. It is to essentially pass those rights over to the other surviving co-owners in law. An illustration of this point can be seen in the case from 1970, the case of Greenfield and Greenfield. Fundamentally, in this case, the parties in the joint tenancy had made physical separations in the property. So what they had done was they divided physically their shares of the land. Now, you might think that this is actually sufficient to imply through either mutual agreement or mutual conduct that there is a severance of the property. Remember, what severance is essentially the process by which a joint tenancy in equity can go from a joint tenancy to a tenancy in common, and the way in which that happens is that you go from acting as a joint holistic group, a single unit of ownership, to owning individual shares of that property. So essentially you go from being an indivisible unit to a divisible unit. The parties to the joint tenancy had made physical separations on the property. So given this fact, surely this means that there was an intention to sever. On first consideration, you might think that severance is implied through the conduct of the parties. However, what is very important here is that despite the fact that there was the division of their shares in the land, at least a physical separation of their property, the right of survivorship was not only still active and present, but it was also agreed upon by all the parties to be active and present. You can't adhere to the right of survivorship or maintain and have a desire to maintain the right of desireship and also wish to sever the property, because the right of survivorship obviously does not work and does not operate in a tenancy in common. So as a result of this, the fact that the right of survivorship was active and present, as agreed by the parties, meant that the severance could not be implied through the mutual conduct of the parties. So it shows that the right of survivorship, of course, is a very, very important element of this area of the law. When we think about the final method of severance, so this is the final method of severance. Remember, we have had the 5 general methods of severance. You have notice, giving written notice to the particular other joint tenants of your intention to sever the property or sever from the property. You have acting on one's own share. So essentially, acting in a way which implies that you have gone from a joint tenancy to a tenancy in common, which would of course be acting in a way that suggests that your joint tenancy is divisible, is therefore you're no longer a part of a cohesive indivisible unit, which is what a joint tenancy would require. That is the second method of severance. Third method of severance was looked at in the previous lesson. This is the method of severance which requires you to essentially by way of mutual agreement, come to a conclusion among all of your joint tenants that you wish to sever, that there is a severance that is going to take place on the property. This can either be expressed or implied. And then finally, there is the implication through mutual conduct, which is often cited as being an indication on a part of the joint tenants that the right of survivorship no longer is effective or operationalized among those joint tenants. The final method of severance is therefore homicide. This final method of severance essentially tells us that if you are a joint tenant with a beneficial interest, you cannot unlawfully kill another joint tenant in order to benefit from the right of survivorship. Remember, in the right of survivorship and under a joint tenancy, the right of survivorship will apply, and it will inform us that where there is the death of one of the joint tenants, the other joint tenants may take up the right of surviving through that property, essentially the right to take up that property. So if the right of survivorship applies and you are a joint tenancy and you decide that you are going to unlawfully kill another joint tenant for the benefit of being able to essentially benefit from the right of survivorship, being able to take their shares in the property, then this is of course unlawful. The death of another co-owner causes their interest in the property to be taken by you would not actually suffice. And so the result of this means that when you unlawfully kill another joint tenant with the view of essentially benefiting from the right of survivorship, you have effectively severed your interest in the property. There is a severance of the interest as a result of that conduct.